$1. That was the price, the clerk announced, his voice flat and bored in the stifling heat of the Redemption, Nevada Territorial Office. It was not a fee for filing a deed or registering a brand. It was the price for the woman standing beside the clerk's desk, her hands bound loosely with a length of twine. She stood perfectly still, a slim figure in a plain grey dress that fell in straight, unfamiliar lines to her ankles. Her face was a mask of calm, her dark eyes fixed on a crack in the floorboards, seeing nothing and everything. Jasper Kane watched from the doorway, the alkali dust of the street still on his boots. He had come to town for salt and flour, not for a wife. But the notice nailed to the marshal's office had caught his eye, disposal of unclaimed property. He knew what it meant. The railroad had moved on, leaving behind its debris, both iron and human. The men who had worked the line were gone, and the Chinese women who had cooked and laundered for them were often left behind, belonging to no one and therefore to anyone with a claim. The clerk, a portly man named Blevins with sweat stains blooming under his arms, looked up at the handful of onlookers. $1. Last call. Otherwise, it's the county's problem. The men shuffled their feet. They saw a burden, another mouth to feed, a silent, foreign creature who understood nothing of their world. Jasper saw the faint, almost invisible tremor in her bound hands. He saw the way she held her spine straight, a single line of defiance in a room full of careless authority. He had a homestead claim 30 miles out, a piece of hard, unforgiving land that the Homestead Act of '62 promised was his if he could prove it up. Part of proving it up, the law said, was a family. A wife. He had figured he would file the paperwork and lie, say his wife was back east, waiting for him to build a proper house. But here was a solution, a sad, complicated solution standing right in front of him. It felt wrong, but leaving her here felt worse. Jasper stepped forward. The floorboards groaned under his weight. He was not a large man, but he moved with a quiet economy that made people notice. The Colt peacemaker on his hip was worn smooth from use, a tool of a trade he was trying to forget. He placed a silver dollar on the scarred surface of the desk. The coin rang with a finality that silenced the room. "I'll take her," Jasper said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. Blevins blinked, surprised. He looked from Jasper's calloused hands to the gun at his hip, then to the woman. "Her name's, well, she don't speak. We don't know her name. She came with the last freight shipment for the railroad camp. Unclaimed." "It doesn't matter," Jasper said. He looked at the woman, meeting her eyes for the first time. There was no fear in them, only a deep, weary stillness. "We need to see the justice of the peace. For the marriage certificate." A ripple of cruel laughter went through the men in the room. "My inner property, Kane," one of them snickered. Jasper's gaze swept over them, cold and flat. The laughter died. He turned back to Blevins, who was already scribbling on a form. "Name for the bride." Jasper looked at the silent woman again. He thought of the quiet canyons on his land, the peaceful moments just before sunrise. "And Jing," he said, the name coming to him from a place he didn't understand. "Her name isn't Jing." Blevins shrugged and wrote it down. He took a knife and sawed through the twine on her wrists. She rubbed the raw skin but made no sound. The justice of the peace was summoned from the saloon next door. He smelled of whiskey and disinterest. The ceremony took less than a minute. No vows were exchanged. A signature from Jasper, and X'd from the justice as a witness, and it was done. Jasper Kane, a man running from his past, was married to a woman who had no voice to tell him hers. He led her out of the office into the brutal glare of the afternoon sun. His wagon, loaded with the flour and salt he'd come for, was hitched in front of the general store. He helped her up onto the seat, his touch on her elbow gentle. She flinched almost imperceptibly, then settled herself, her back as straight as before. As he climbed up beside her, he saw Bartholomew Thorne watching from the veranda of his freight company office. Thorne was a man who owned most of Redemption, from the saloon to the land office clerks. He had a proprietary air about him, and his smile, as he looked at Jing, was thin and unpleasant. It was the smile of a man who had just misplaced something valuable and was watching someone else find it. Jasper ignored him, flicking the reins. The wagon lurched forward, leaving the dusty town and its judgments behind them. The journey to his claim was a long, silent one. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels and the plodding of the mule. The sun beat down, baking the earth and bleaching the sky to a pale, hazy blue. And Jing sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. She did not look at the passing landscape, a vast, empty expanse of sagebrush and rock that would have terrified a woman from the green hills of the east. She simply sat, contained and composed, as if the hard wooden seat of a freight wagon was no different from any other place. Jasper felt the weight of her silence more than any conversation. He was a man accustomed to solitude, but this was different. It was a shared quiet, filled with unanswered questions. He glanced at her from the corner of his eye. Her grey dress was simple, but the fabric was of a good quality, and the stitching was fine and even. It was not the dress of a common labourer. Her hands, though chapped and marked from the twine, were slender, her nails clean. Nothing about her fit the story Blevins had told. They arrived at his homestead as the sun began to dip below the western mesas, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The homestead was little more than a dugout carved into the side of a low hill, with a rough-hewn timber front and a sod roof. A small, sturdy corral held his horse, and a half-finished frame for a proper cabin stood nearby, a testament to plans that always seemed to be interrupted. It was a lonely, stark place, a raw beginning scraped from the wilderness. He pulled the wagon to a halt and jumped down. "We're here," he said, the words sounding inadequate. He walked around to her side and held up a hand to help her down. She hesitated for a moment, then placed her small hand in his. Her skin was cool despite the heat. He helped her to the ground and she stood, looking at the dugout, her expression unreadable. He expected tears, or perhaps a look of despair. He saw neither. She simply took in the scene with that unnerving stillness. "It ain't much," Jasper said, feeling a strange need to apologize. "I'm building the cabin. It'll be better soon." She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He led her inside the dugout. It was dark and cool, smelling of earth and wood smoke. A simple cot stood in one corner, a rough table and 2 stools in the center. A stone hearth was built into the back wall, the ashes from his morning fire cold. He had nothing to offer her, no comfort, no welcome. He had bought a wife for $1, and he had brought her to a hole in the ground. The shame of it sat heavy in his gut. He busied himself unhitching the mule and tending to the animals, giving her time to acclimate. When he returned, she had found the broom, a bundle of stiff grass tied to a stick, and was sweeping the packed earth floor. The movements were small, precise, and efficient. She had taken the few possessions she carried in a small cloth bundle and placed them neatly on one of the stools. She was not waiting to be told what to do, she was making a space for herself in his world. That night, he cooked a simple meal of bacon and beans over the fire. They ate in silence at the small table. He was acutely aware of every sound, the scrape of his fork against the tin plate, the crackle of the fire, the cry of a coyote in the distance. After they ate, he took a blanket and went outside, gesturing for her to take the cot. "You sleep inside," he said. "I'll be out here." She watched him, her dark eyes seeming to search his face in the flickering firelight. He thought he saw a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps, or gratitude. She gave another one of her small nods. He turned and walked out into the cool desert night, rolling himself in the blanket near the half-finished cabin. He lay there for a long time, looking up at the vast canopy of stars, feeling more alone than he ever had before. He had a wife, a home, a piece of land. He had all the pieces of a new life, but he had no idea how they fit together. And he had a feeling that the smile on Bartholomew Thorne's face back in town was a promise of trouble yet to come. The trouble arrived 3 days later. Jasper was splitting logs for the cabin frame, the rhythmic thud of the axe the only sound in the morning air. And Jing was tending to a small patch of ground near the dugout, where she had found a seep of moisture and was attempting to coax a few wild herbs to grow. She had a touch with living things, a patience that seemed to coax life from the unforgiving soil. A dust cloud on the horizon announced the visitors long before they arrived. Jasper stopped his work, his hand resting instinctively on the hilt of his Colt. 2 riders emerged from the dust. One was Bartholomew Thorne, dressed in a fine city coat despite the heat. The other was one of his hired men, a big, rough-looking man with a rifle resting across his saddle. They rode right up to the cabin frame and stopped, looking down at Jasper with undisguised contempt. Thorne's gaze, however, quickly found Jing. He smiled that thin, proprietary smile again. "Kane," Thorne said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "I see you've put my property to work. I trust she's earning her keep." Jasper's grip tightened on the axe handle. "She's my wife," he said, his voice low and even. "Not your property." Thorne laughed, a dry, unpleasant sound. $1 and a drunk justice of the peace don't make a marriage, Kane. They make a bill of sale. I had an arrangement for her, a business transaction that was unfortunately delayed. I've come to collect what's mine. Jing had frozen by her small garden, her face pale. She watched Thorne, and for the first time, Jasper saw a clear emotion in her eyes, a cold, deep-seated fear. "She's not for sale," Jasper said. "You'd best ride on, Thorne." "I don't think you understand your position," Thorne said, his smile vanishing. He gestured at the barren landscape. "You're 30 miles from town. Your nearest neighbor is a rattlesnake. Your water comes from a spring that, coincidentally, is on land I just acquired. The deed was filed yesterday. Funny how these things work out." The threat was clear. Thorne could cut him off, starve him out, and no one would ever know or care. The land baron owned the water, the freight, and the law in redemption. Jasper was one man with a half-finished cabin and a gun. "The spring is on my claim," Jasper said, though a cold knot was forming in his stomach. He knew how easily paperwork could be corrected at the territorial office. "A clerical error," Thorne said smoothly. "One that will be rectified. Now, be a reasonable man. I'll give you $20 for your trouble. A handsome profit on your investment. You can take the money, ride out, and forget any of this ever happened." Jasper looked from Thorne's smug face to Jing. She was still watching them, her body rigid with tension. She had been property, a piece in Thorne's game, and he had made her a wife. He had made her a promise, even if it was one spoken only to a disinterested justice of the peace. He couldn't sell her back. He couldn't sell her at all. "The answer is no," Jasper said. He let the axe fall to the ground and straightened up, his hand now resting loosely near his pistol. Thorne's eyes narrowed. He looked at his hired man, then back at Jasper. "You're making a mistake, Kane. A man with a past like yours should know better than to make enemies of men like me," he knew. Of course, Thorne knew. Men like Thorne made it their business to know the secrets of everyone in their territory. "Get off my land," Jasper said. For a long moment, no one moved. The silence stretched, tight and brittle. Thorne finally broke it with a sigh of theatrical disappointment. "Very well. Have it your way," he turned his horse. "But remember, Kane. Everything in this desert needs water." They rode off, leaving a trail of dust and a heavy silence behind them. Jasper watched them go, the cold knot in his stomach tightening. He had just declared war on the most powerful man in the county. He turned to look at Jing. She was still standing by her garden, but her gaze was fixed on him. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by something else, something he couldn't quite name. It looked like a question, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of trust. What she did not know was that by choosing her over Thorne's offer, he had just forfeited the one thing he had come to this desolate land to find, peace. That evening, the air in the dugout was thick with unspoken tension. Jasper checked his pistol, cleaning and oiling it with deliberate, practiced movements. It was an old habit, one he had tried to leave behind, but it returned now as easily as breathing. Jing watched him from the table where she was mending a tear in his shirt. The needle moved with a swift, sure grace in her fingers. She had found his sewing kit, a simple soldier's roll of thread and needles, and set about repairing his worn clothes without a word. He finished with the gun and laid it on the mantel of the hearth. He sat down opposite her, the small table feeling like a vast distance between them. "He'll be back," Jasper said, breaking the silence. "Or he'll send his men. He won't let this go." She looked up from her sewing, her eyes meeting his. She paused, then set the shirt down and reached for the small slate he used for tallying supplies. It was the first time she had ever sought to communicate with him beyond a simple nod. She picked up a piece of charcoal and, with small, elegant strokes, began to write. The characters were not the clumsy letters of an uneducated person. They were precise, balanced, and confident. He watched, fascinated, as a story unfolded on the small black surface. She wrote in English. "His name is Thorn. He brought me from San Francisco." Jasper leaned forward, his weariness forgotten. "Why?" She wiped the slate clean with the heel of her hand and wrote again. "My father is a merchant. Mr. Chen. Thorn wanted a shipping contract. He said my father was cheating him. He took me. To make my father pay." The pieces clicked into place. The fine dress. The slender hands. The quiet dignity. She was not unclaimed railroad property. She was a hostage. "The deal failed," she wrote, her hand moving faster now. "My father refused to be threatened. Thorn was angry. He was going to sell me to a man who runs mines in Mexico. Then you came." She paused, the charcoal hovering over the slate. She looked at him, her eyes wide and dark in the lamplight, and wrote 2 words. "You paid." The simplicity of it hit him like a physical blow. "You paid. Not you saved me, not you rescued me. You paid." He had participated in the transaction that reduced her to a commodity, even if his motives were different. "And Jing," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "I didn't know. I couldn't leave you there." She studied his face for a long moment, then wrote again. "You called me by my name." He frowned. "I made it up. I didn't know what to call you." A faint, fleeting smile touched her lips, the first he had ever seen. It transformed her face, chasing away the shadows. "And Jing is my name," she wrote. "My real name." It was a coincidence so profound it felt like fate. A 1 in a million chance that the name he had plucked from the air was hers. It was a sign, a bond forged in the dusty office that neither of them had understood until now. He felt something shift inside him, a wall he had carefully built around his heart beginning to crumble. This was no longer about a homestead claim or a convenient wife. This was about the woman sitting across from him, a woman named Jing who had been stolen from her life and who was now his responsibility. She reached into a small cloth bundle that held her few belongings. From it, she took a small, flat object wrapped in silk. She unwrapped it carefully and pushed it across the table toward him. It was a piece of jade, carved into the shape of a crane, smooth and cool to the touch. It was exquisitely made, an object of obvious value and artistry. "Proof," she wrote on the slate. "My father's seal." This changed everything. She wasn't just a victim, she was the daughter of a powerful man. A man who was likely searching for her. Thorn wasn't just a bully, he was a kidnapper. And Jasper was now harboring a witness to a serious crime. "We have to get you back to your father," he said. "We can send a telegraph from a bigger town. Carson City, maybe." She shook her head, her expression turning urgent. She wiped the slate and wrote quickly. "Thorn controls the telegraph office in Redemption. His men watch the roads. We cannot leave. Not yet." She was right. They were trapped. Thorn wouldn't let them get far enough to tell their story. He had meant to isolate them by controlling the water, but now Jasper understood Thorn's real fear. It wasn't about losing a $1 bride. It was about losing his freedom. And Jing was the only person who could connect him to the kidnapping. As long as she was alive and free, he was in danger. A floorboard creaked outside. Jasper was on his feet in an instant, the Colt in his hand, his body shielding Jing. He blew out the lamp, plunging the dugout into near-total darkness, save for the faint moonlight filtering through the single small window. He moved to the door, pressing his ear against the rough wood. He heard the soft nicker of a horse, too close. And then the crunch of a boot on dry soil. They weren't waiting for the water to run out. They had come for her. He motioned for Jing to get down, to move to the back of the dugout near the hearth. She obeyed without a sound, her movement swift and silent in the dark. He could see her silhouette, a small, huddled shape against the stone. He felt a surge of cold fury. They had turned his home into a trap. "Kane," a voice called from the darkness. It wasn't Thorn. It was the hired man, the big one. "The boss wants the woman. Send her out, and we'll let you walk away." It was a lie. They would never let him walk away. He was a witness, too. Jasper remained silent, his eyes scanning the darkness outside the window. He could make out two shapes, maybe three, moving near the corral. They were trying to draw him out. He thought of his horse, a good, steady bay, trapped in the corral. They would use the animal to get to him if they had to. He had a choice. He could try to make a run for it in the dark, but they were on horseback, and he and Jing would be on foot. A losing race. Or he could stay here, in his hole in the ground, and make his stand. It wasn't much of a fortress, but it was his. He looked back at Jing. He could not see her face in the gloom, but he could feel her presence, her quiet courage. He had bought her for $1, but standing with her now, he would not have sold her back for all the gold in Nevada. He had been running from his past for 5 years, trying to bury the man he used to be under sweat and soil. But Thorn had dug him up. He raised the Colt, the weight of it familiar and terrible in his hand. He was Jasper Kane, the homesteader. But tonight, he would have to be the man he was before. The man who knew how to survive the night. He took a deep breath, the earthen smell of his home filling his lungs, and prepared for the fight. The night exploded in a flash of gunfire. A bullet tore through the wooden door, splintering the timber and burying itself in the earthen wall behind Jasper. He didn't fire back. A fool wastes ammunition shooting at shadows. He stayed low, listening, letting the ringing in his ears subside. He needed to know their positions. Another shot, this one shattering the single glass pane of his small window. They were trying to flush him out, to make him panic. He heard them talking in low voices near the corral. They were getting impatient. Good. Impatient men made mistakes. Jing remained perfectly still by the hearth, a silent shadow in the darkness. He was grateful for her calm. A screaming woman would have given away their exact position. Her stillness was a weapon, a small anchor of sanity in the chaos. He crept to the window, peering through the shattered frame. The moonlight was bright, illuminating the stark landscape. He saw one of them, the big man, moving toward the dugout, using the half-finished cabin frame for cover. Another was by the corral gate, likely planning to release his horse to create a diversion. A third, he guessed, was further back, providing cover fire. Jasper knew his dugout had a weakness, but also a hidden strength. The sod roof was thick, but the front was timber. What Thorn's men didn't know was that he had dug a small root cellar at the back, its entrance concealed by a stack of firewood near the hearth. It led to a narrow tunnel, barely big enough for a man to crawl through, that opened up in a shallow ravine about 50 yards behind the dugout. It was an escape route, a lesson learned from a hard life. He moved silently back to Jing. He knelt beside her, his hand gently touching her shoulder. She didn't jump. He pointed toward the firewood, then made a crawling motion with his hand. He needed her to go first. She looked at him, her eyes wide in the gloom. He could see the question in them. Was he coming with her? He gave a single, firm nod. "Trust me." She moved the firewood with a quiet efficiency that amazed him. The small wooden hatch to the cellar was revealed. She lifted it and, without hesitation, slipped into the darkness below. Jasper waited. He needed to give her a head start and create a diversion of his own. He picked up a tin plate from the table and hurled it toward the far corner of the dugout. It clattered loudly. As he expected, a volley of shots ripped through the wall where the sound had come from. In that moment of distraction, he fired a single shot from his Colt through the window, aiming not at the man but at the wooden beam above him in the cabin frame. He was rewarded with a curse and the sound of splintering wood. He didn't wait to see the result. He scrambled back to the open hatch and slid into the cellar, pulling the cover closed above him. The tunnel was tight and smelled of damp earth. He crawled on his hands and knees, the gun held tight in one hand. He could hear Jing moving ahead of him. He could also hear the muffled shouts of the men outside, confused by his sudden silence. They would assume he was wounded or dead. They would get bold. He emerged from the tunnel into the cool night air of the ravine. Jing was waiting for him, pressed against the rocky wall. He put a finger to his lips and pointed up, toward the rim of the ravine. They crept along the base of the gully, using the shadows for cover. From their new vantage point, they could see the entire homestead. Thorne's men were closing in on the dugout. The big man kicked the door in, while another circled around the back. They were walking into an empty trap. Jasper raised his pistol. He was not a murderer. He had killed men, but only when he had no other choice. Tonight, his goal was not to kill, but to survive. He aimed for the man near the corral. He squeezed the trigger. The shot was clean. The man cried out and dropped, clutching his leg. His horse, spooked by the shot from an unexpected direction, reared and bolted, galloping off into the desert. The big man rushed out of the dugout, firing wildly into the ravine. Jasper and Jing were already moving, scrambling further down the gully. The third man, realizing they were flanked, began firing as well, the bullets kicking up dust around them. They had lost the element of surprise. Now it was a race. Their only hope was to get to the rocks on the far side of the claim, a place where a man on foot had a better chance than men on horseback. They ran, their lungs burning, the sound of their own footsteps loud in their ears. A bullet whizzed past Jasper's head, so close he felt the heat of it. He pushed Jing ahead of him, shielding her with his body. They reached the edge of the rocky outcrop and scrambled for cover. They were pinned down. But the odds had changed. It was 2 against 2 now, with one of Thorne's men wounded. And Jasper knew this land. He knew every rock, every crevice. This was his ground. He reloaded his pistol, the click of the cylinder seating the cartridges sounding loud in the night. He looked at Jing, huddled beside him. Her face was smudged with dirt, her dress torn, but her eyes were clear and steady. She was no longer afraid. She was a survivor. In that moment, he knew he wasn't just fighting for his land or his life. He was fighting for hers. The standoff lasted until dawn. As the first pale light touched the eastern sky, a new dust cloud appeared on the horizon. Not the small, tight cloud of a few riders, but the larger, more deliberate plume of a wagon, maybe 2. Thorne's men saw it too. They exchanged a few more shots, then mounted up, dragging their wounded companion with them. They weren't willing to face unknown reinforcements. They retreated, melting back into the landscape as the sun rose. Jasper and Jing watched them go, not moving from the safety of the rocks until they were sure. He was down to his last 3 bullets. He slowly stood up, his body aching, and helped her to her feet. They looked back at their home. The dugout door was broken, the window shattered, the cabin frame riddled with bullet holes. It was a ruin. But they were alive. The approaching wagons were not Thorne's. One was a simple buckboard, driven by a U.S. Marshal with a weary, determined face. The other was a finer carriage, and as it drew closer, a well-dressed Chinese man in his late 50s stepped out. He scanned the scene, his eyes sharp and worried, until they fell on Jing. "And Jing," he cried, his voice breaking with relief. And Jing made a sound, a small, choked gasp. It was the first sound Jasper had ever heard her make. She took a step, then another, and then she was running, stumbling across the broken ground toward the man. Her father. 3 months later, the summer heat had given way to the crisp air of autumn. The shattered window of the dugout had been replaced, and the cabin was finished. It was small but solid, with a proper plank floor and a stone fireplace that drew well. A garden, green and thriving, grew near the new well Jasper had dug, far from the spring Thorn had tried to steal. Bartholomew Thorn was gone. The U.S. Marshal, acting on the testimony of Mr. Chen and the evidence Jasper provided, had issued a warrant for his arrest on charges of kidnapping. Thorn, ever the coward, had fled the territory before the warrant could be served, his land and businesses seized to pay his debts. Redemption was a quieter, fairer town without him. Mr. Chen had offered Jasper a reward, a sum of money that would have allowed him to buy the finest ranch in Nevada. Jasper had refused. "I didn't do it for money," he had told the merchant. Mr. Chen had studied him for a long moment, then nodded in understanding. He had stayed for a week, helping them repair the damage, his gratitude quiet but profound. When it was time for him to take Jing back to the comforts of San Francisco, she had refused to go. She had stood beside Jasper, in front of the new cabin, and spoken her first full sentence in over a year. Her voice was quiet, a little rough from disuse, but clear. "This is my home now," she had said, looking at her father, but her hand had found Jasper's. And so, she had stayed. Now, Jasper stood by the corral fence, watching the sun set behind the mesas. The air was cool, and the sky was a deep, impossible blue. He heard the cabin door open and turned to see Jing walking toward him. She carried 2 tin cups of coffee, steam rising from them in the evening chill. She handed him a cup, her fingers brushing against his. The simple touch sent a warmth through him that had nothing to do with the coffee. "The nights are getting colder," she said, her voice still soft, but gaining strength every day. "Yes," he said. "Winter will be here soon." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the last of the light fade. The world he had sought, a world of peace and quiet purpose, was finally his. It looked nothing like he had imagined. It was harder, and it was richer. He reached into his pocket and his fingers closed around the smooth, worn surface of a silver dollar. The price he had paid. He looked at Jing, at the quiet strength in her face, at the small smile that was reserved only for him. He had paid $1, and in return, he had been given everything. A life wasn't something you bought. It was something you were given, and something you built together, piece by piece, out of the dust and the danger, until it became a home. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.